So I'm here recording today with Stetson. How are you doing, Stetson?
Doing great. How about you?
I'm doing very well. I was very impressed by your blog, Holodoxa, here on Substack. You cover a lot of topics in depth from a scientific background. One of the things when I was looking through your stuff, I noticed that there was a lot about cancer, and cancer is one of these areas that I think affects people, more and more. This is a growing problem. It's not a static issue. It's not something like, automobile deaths where there's fluctuation, but it stays within a range. We know what to expect every year. Um, with cancer, it's one of these diseases that seems to be getting worse. And so there's a couple of different theories about why that might be, and I want to get into that with you. But first of all, I want to just kind of establish, how important is this? How do we quantify the cost of cancer? Is this something that obviously human death? I this question comes up a lot of in terms of public policy. Is this something where we even can just throw money at the problem to solve it? Some people say cancer cures are likely. Some people say it's I don't want to say a hoax or a scam, but there's an effective altruist crowd which is like,
Uh-huh.
let's just malaria nets. We know they work. Let's get the malaria
hmm
nets. Simple stuff. Don't get Whereas you get into these
Yeah.
really high tech, really complicated areas, and
hmm
sometimes is it like when we're trying to lower death due to cancer, should we be focused on preventative, environmental, dietary, genetic screening, genetic testing before it comes, or should we be concerned with how to cure it once it's already started? Give me
hmm
some foundational facts on the ground.
Sure. I think those are really great questions, especially because there is this widespread belief among people who generally not necessarily the highest educated crowd that think there is a cure for cancer floating around out there that big pharma is preventing from getting out there. And obviously, I understand this belief existing, given there are potentially good reasons to have low institutional trust, low social trust for some communities. But in reality, cancer is many, many, many different diseases, and it's something that is essentially the inevitable outcome of just aging as a multicellular complex organism. And so we'll never be able to forever eradicate cancer. There will be a Sisyphusian battle against cancer. And we'll have to have many different treatment approaches and many different diagnostic and other types of clinical management approaches in order to reduce mortality from cancer, reduce morbidity from cancer, reduce the economic burdens of cancer, which are, of course, substantial. I mean, if you look at the top killers in the United States, for example, heart disease and cancer are always top one and top two, essentially always in that position, respectively. Even during the peak of the COVID pandemic, mortality was those heart disease and cancer were not displaced from their top spots, which is remarkable. It's roughly like over 500,000 Americans per year are killed by each of those. And I think ideally we get to a spot where cancer is the top killer in America. And that this will represent the fact that, something like heart disease or diabetes or even maybe neurodegenerative conditions could be thought of as chronic conditions that we can manage and prevent more easily than cancer. Obviously, we want to approach the cancer problem as well by preventing and intervening as much as possible. But the extent to which lifestyle and behavioral outcomes are inputs on cancer are more marginal than, say, for something like heart disease or diabetes or these sorts of other big killers out there. They still matter. Obesity, alcohol abuse, obviously smoking was significant as well, and we've intervened effectively on smoking at the population level. But it's still going to be there. Eventually, it's like 1 in 2, 50% chance essentially over your lifetime that you're going to have cancer. Breast cancer is very common among women. Prostate cancer is very common among men. A lot of times, necessarily, even though they may get these, you may get a cancer diagnosis in your life. It may not be what kills you, but if you could prevent the other things that kill you, the cancer is probably eventually coming for you, and that's kind of unfortunately the situation. There's no quick fix for cancer.
All right, so all of that is interesting. It's kind of morbid to think about that cancer is. It's not a human problem. It's not like some organisms don't have hearts, or they if they have a heart or a circulatory system is very different from
Mhm.
ours. So like an ant probably isn't going to get heart disease. Whereas cancer is something that, as you said, it's just inherent. Like the term, I guess, is just referring to a cell which there's some mutation that has affected its individual or what is it, cell division, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So we're multicellular organisms, right? There are many different cells in our body. They're specialized. They do different things, but we all start from one cell at first, right? The sperm fertilizes the egg. Well, two cells come together, but those are haploid cells, and we get a diploid, meaning you go have a paternal genome and a maternal genome, and then cell division explodes, and we develop into an organism. And so there's this battle in the organism between proliferation and what we call differentiation, which is basically the cell developing into its mature form. And so that dynamic process can be interfered on by mutations that occur in the cell. And these mutations, they can occur because of environmental insults, or because you may have inherited a mutation as well. But most of the time, what we're talking about here are mutations that simply occur randomly, and they occur randomly because of the way that the cellular machinery works in cell division. So there are these proteins called polymerases, and they are responsible for copying the DNA of a cell when it divides, because it has to copy the DNA so it can put it in the daughter cell when the cell splits apart. And that process is just inherently leaky. There are mistakes that get made. There's even a proofreading function that's built into the polymerase, but it's imperfect. And so we know that every division, there's a certain number of mutations that will happen. And over your lifetime, cells divide, cells divide, cell divide, and you're just accumulating somatic mutations. And over time, that degrades the control that a cell has over its processes of growth and proliferation, and you lose that control, and it develops into cancer. Now, there's other mechanisms, like your immune system can detect that process going on and can kill essentially a precancerous or cancerous cell that's transformed in this way. But also your immune system is aging over time, so your body gets worse and worse at doing that as well. And so again, that's why there's an age correlation with cancer.
so I'm looking at a few different maps here. Obviously, if we look at a map of the world, we're going to see that deaths due to cancer are going to be lower in the developing world because there's so many other problems they're dealing with. They're not getting to those older ages where cancer incidence is high. But within the United States, there are different rates of cancer incidence, and I think that's even true if we control for life expectancy. So it's not a unit. We don't live in a uniform environment. Especially, I've noticed eastern Kentucky. So this is the Appalachian region of
Yep.
Kentucky. This is an area of, and also the Mississippi Delta. These are
Mhm.
areas of endemic poverty. These are areas with very high welfare usage, and these are
Mhm.
areas. These two areas I've just mentioned have extremely different demographics. So the Mississippi
Mhm.
Delta is an area of the country which is the most majority black of anywhere in the country, and
Mhm.
eastern Kentucky is one of the most demographically white areas of the country. So they couldn't be
Mhm.
more different in terms of racial background. But what they have in common is endemic poverty. People are not really drawn to those reasons, or excuse me, those regions do not attract people economically. They don't have universities where people are coming in. They don't have job offerings. They don't have big urban cities that people are attracted to. And so the people who are there are sort of left behind. The people who can afford to leave because they can get a college degree, they can get a job opportunity elsewhere, they do leave. So, and so there's a sort of brain drain from those areas of the people who are capable to leave. The people who are stuck stay, and you have these high rates of cancer. And so, I guess my question is: you said earlier that things like heart disease, these are diseases that are there's obviously a genetic role in all diseases. But these are diseases where we can say, hey, if you could switch to a vegetarian diet or something, your rate of heart disease is going to plummet versus if you're eating, red meat and so on. I'm going to continue eating red meat, but it's just a true fact,
Me too.
right? So there are certain facts
Yes.
about that. But with cancer, is this a you're specialized in the genetic causes, and you're saying that overall compared to other disease, there's less room for environment. And so I guess my question is when we look at these hot spots geographically in America, the people who are most vulnerable to cancer, is this still environmental? Is there a role for genetics to play? How do we explain this?
Yeah, so the epidemiological pattern that shows this regional, essentially increased in incidence, and I think more so in mortality from cancer in these regions, is likely related to behavioral factors, and then also just institutional slash investment support in those regions. So like I think the bigger difference is on the mortality side than the incidence, and the extent to which there are differences in incidence in cancer between poor communities in these regions that you specified, and then in wealthier communities, say like the Acela corridor and whatnot, are mostly driven by lifestyle and behavioral factors. And it's indicated by if you look at the type of cancers that are increased in rates, so it's like liver, esophageal, laryngeal, cervical cancers that are really increased in incidence in these regions. And those are cancers that we know quite clearly are related to behavioral factors, like liver for alcohol abuse, and, esophageal and laryngeal, smoking and tobacco product use. So things like that explain those differences. And then obviously obesity is an important factor too. And there's obviously quite a strong correlation between low SES and obesity. And I think we're increasingly learning that relationship is explained to some extent by psychological slash cognitive differences between some of these populations. Like you said, there's a bit of a brain drain from these communities. So the people who have the ability, some maybe a little bit more of an inherent inability to obtain an education and intelligence, are exiting these regions. And so either people who may be a little bit lower in conscientiousness, a little bit lower in intelligence, they can't necessarily make the best decisions for themselves, and they're ending up in a lifestyle pattern that leads to obesity and whatnot. This doesn't exclude the possibility of some environmental exposures. Like if you look at these maps, I think the map you're kind of referring to, or at least the map that I'm looking at here, is from a JAMA oncology paper, and it is looking at these differences in incidence across like a county by county level from like the 5 years in the late 2010s. And, you see a especially strong concentration like in West Virginia, Appalachian area. And I mean, it could be related to, some of the coal mining activities and so on, or just the industries that are there. And I don't know how well that's been demonstrated or to what extent, but I don't want to say that there's no environmental effects. There are some, but especially with air pollution, I think that's one of the better demonstrated relationships that exist there. So I'm not sure if I answered all your questions there, but I think we touched on some of the things. So
Yeah, I
hopefully
think
that's
one of
good.
the most interesting. So you mentioned cervical cancer. Now, is that
Mhm.
something? The
Mhm.
cervix as a part of the reproductive system.
Yep.
Am I correct to say that sexually transmitted infections and diseases can
Yep.
lead to increased cancer? Because I've seen data that shows that despite sexual education, safe sex, the introduction of condoms, all of these
Mhm.
things. I have an article that I'm working on to try to figure out why are rates of STDs going up despite all of
Mhm.
this new education, all of these new, people are using
Yeah.
condoms more than ever before in history, and yet
Mhm.
we have this rising STD rate. So that might be one
Yeah.
of the reasons why cancer, that particular form, might be going up. And the other thing you mentioned was obesity, which I've
Mhm.
never I never knew that before, that there was a link between obesity and cancer.
Yeah.
Just my intuitive attempt to explain that would be more cells, more opportunity for mutation of cells. I mean, just in terms of the like, I don't know, somebody who is within a normal BMI just has this many trillion cells, and then someone who's twice their size has twice as many cells, and so on. What sort
Oh,
of cancers are most increased in their incidence by obesity?
oh, phew. I wish I knew offhand exactly the. I think it's essentially, for the most part, obesity is related to globally related to increase in pretty much almost all cancers. I can't. I'm sure there's probably stronger relationships with particular ones, and I would imagine it would be those in related pathways. And I think mostly the reason there's a relationship between obesity and cancer has to do with not necessarily more cells existing, because actually obesity is typically hypertrophy. So you have like essentially the same number of adipocytes, which are the fat cells, and they just get bigger. They start storing more and more fat. And it's not that you're necessarily having more cells. You can. There's like different things can happen, but for the most part, it's the cells are just getting bigger. Just like most of the time with like when you grow your like when a bodybuilder goes to the gym and they work their muscles, they're not making more muscle cells when the muscles regrow. Mostly the muscle cells are getting bigger, and they're making more protein within the same existing cellular architecture. And so I really should know which cancers are more specifically related to obesity. I don't know that, but the reason that obesity probably contributes to cancer is, you just have a higher level of inflammation in the body globally. And so you get a little bit of immune dysregulation. So the immune system, as I mentioned before, is important as a sort of surveillance mechanism against preventing the natural kind of precancerous clones that are popping up in the body all the time. And then also the fact that, obesity is kind of like an endocrine disorder of some sorts. There's a lot of hormonal type signals that get secreted by fat cells, and those get really dysregulated when you are in a situation of obesity. You get dysregulation of your metabolism. These are all processes that are likely to increase the amount of genomic instability in the cells that are getting exposed to this sort of environment, the obesogenic environment inside of the body. So,
Wow, interesting. So yeah, that's a good fact check or thing that I'm learning is with cells aren't I'm not actually gaining more muscle cells, and I'm not gaining more fat cells. They're just getting bigger.
yeah.
Um, and okay, so you mentioned two things. You mentioned the immune system. You mentioned inflammation.
Mhm.
So when I think of inflammation, typically I think about heat. I think about like something, it's got the word flame in it. So I'm thinking, things
Yeah.
are heating up. Like if you have a fever or something, or if you have an injury and they say you need to put an ice pack on that so you reduce the swelling because it's inflamed. So you need to
Right.
literally cool it down. So why do so? I guess again, I'll give you my my intuition, and you can correct it.
Yep.
My like intuitive guess about this would be that somebody who is obese, you're creating stress in the body, and as you
Mhm.
create that stress
Yes.
response, everything has to work harder. Your heart has to work harder, your muscles, your skeletal ligaments,
Yes.
everything's working harder. Your liver's working harder because you're
Yep.
consuming more stuff, so there's more stuff to be processed. Your stomach's working harder, and so everything's basically, it's like if you have a car and you load up your car like past the weight limit of the car with like heavy lead bricks,
Mhm.
then your engine's going to start overheating. And then you're going to start to get problems with the engine, and eventually it's going to break down much faster. Is
Mhm.
that like an accurate model of what's going on with inflammation?
I think it's a fine lay metaphor. Um, there are typically 5 cardinal signs of inflammation in the body, and it's just pain, heat, redness, swelling, loss of function. But like what's actually happening at the cellular level is your cells, the immune cells of the body, are secreting things like cytokines. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but they're like these small, soluble signals that immune cells secrete, and that is like changing the behavior of other immune cells. They're getting angry in the body, and they're doing things like destroying cells, killing cells, and sometimes these are, they're supposed to be killing cells that should be killed of your body, or they're supposed to be killing pathogens, but they're starting to kill healthy cells or things like that, for example. And so this sort of thing can go on. Obviously, you're probably familiar with autoimmune conditions, right? And the immune system is an imperfect system. It can start attacking you, and there's many ways to get to that. And to some extent, I think we can think of obesity sometimes as contributing to similar types of dysregulation that can be analogized to something like autoimmune disease. It's not necessarily that. It's just that the complex physiology that we're talking about here, it's not what should be going on in a normal sized homeostatic body. And to some extent, the analogy you're making where you're just loading too much stress on the body is true with obesity. You've totally taken what should be the normal metabolic situation and you've made it way out of whack. And I think that's a good analogy. And I did want to return to your point about cervical cancer. So cervical cancer, I'm not sure if you're aware or not, is actually tightly associated with a specific sexually transmitted disease, and that's HPV, so human papillomavirus. And we have an effective intervention for that as well. It's the HPV vaccine, Gardasil. And we know it's effective at preventing cervical cancer. We have great epidemiological evidence on that now. And I don't know the differential rates of HPV vaccine uptake, but I would imagine that there is a lower uptake in some of the regions that we've been talking about. And that may explain the difference in incidence between those regions.
Do you think that, so in terms of maybe, I still want to talk about immune function and how
yes.
the pathway that can lead to cancer. But in terms of maybe getting into a little bit of policy, do you think, so we have a slate of vaccines that we require for public school attendance, like smallpox and, a whole others. Do you think that, for instance, I think the last one I had to get was for tetanus, the tetanus shot, for certain forms of employment. Do you think that an HPV vaccine, the reason why I guess I'm asking this question is I don't think it's already been mandated. I think it's generally and also I believe the reason why is because it is not a lifelong vaccine. You don't just get the HPV vaccine and it protects you for life, or am I wrong about that?
No, I do believe it's a lifetime vaccine. It's a course of 3 separate vaccinations. That's just the course of how it's given, and it's usually given to both men and women, but they're basically girls and boys when they receive it. It's around essentially your early teenage years is when you're supposed to receive your course of Gardasil. And you can still receive it any other time afterwards, but you're supposed to, I guess that's when it's studied, is to receive it in those years, obviously prior to your becoming sexually active. And it should prevent you. And our evidence suggests that it does protect you from infection and thus from in women cervical cancer. But it's good to vaccinate the men as well because it prevents transmission over in the population in general. And so, why is it not mandated? I think that just is related to sensitivities around sexual activity in different populations. There's a level of paternalism to say that, some people may never become sexually active over their entire life. So why would we necessarily recommend a medical intervention that may not be relevant to them at all if they never choose to be sexually active? And so I think that is, and then obviously there's sensitivities around, does it make it permissible for people to participate in sexual activity if you're saying, okay, now you're protected against sexually transmitted infection, and people don't, there's kind of a history of people sometimes using the sexual education as a way about education about sexually transmitted infection as a way to dissuade young hormonal teenagers from engaging prematurely in sexual activity. Obviously, harken back to like a movie like Mean Girls, if you have sex, like you'll die or whatever, is that scene with the gym coach, right? And that's kind of the message that they want to deliver, and maybe mandating this would sort of conflict with that message. I don't know. I'm not the one making these decisions personally. I think that I got Gardasil when it came out. I think I was around this age, and that's when I got Gardasil. Of course, my mother's a physician. And so it's a different situation probably. And so I would recommend that if, I was making a decision, but I'm not. So
Yeah, the one caveat, I guess I agree with a lot of what you're saying. The one caveat is, I guess, um, and I don't actually understand anecdotally. I knew somebody who was male. They had Gardasil, and that there was something having to do with, I think it was vitamin A toxicity, that I don't know was a result of the vaccine itself, but it may have been a result of an introduction of some kind of a supplement given afterward and separate from Gardasil. And I'm not actually sure why those two things would be related at all. So I don't have the expertise to speak on that. But
yeah,
that's a particular thing that I think so there's multiple issues here. There's vaccine skepticism in general,
yeah,
but then there's also what you're talking about is saying that and actually, I know we're kind of laughing about this, but I
yeah,
think it's very true. Again, anecdotally, I don't have data to back this up, but I think that there's a percentage of the population, and maybe again, I could speak to this, or other people could speak to this, that psychologically, the idea that sexual activity has some kind of disease risk associated with it, I think does change people's behavior. I think if we did have, if we could solve STDs, if we could totally, prevent that or whatever, and that was what our sexual education reflected. We said, oh, there's no such thing as an STD anymore. We cured all of that. I think people's behavior would change. So, it is maybe a silly thing, and it's almost a chicken or egg in some case of why people psychologically do we prior to our knowledge of infectious diseases, prior to germ theory, people still had ideas about how disease was transmitted, primitive ideas that maybe originated from intuition or kind of guess and check over time. So I mean, it's an interesting historical question, but that mystery we might not be able to solve today.
yeah,
I guess I want to talk a little bit. We talked a little bit about some of the environment. I wanted to. Oh
yeah,
yes, the immune. So
yes,
when we say that our immune response, I think you used the word cytokine.
yeah, yeah.
When our immune response is increasing the risk of cancer, is that because of an increased immune response? Because there's too much white blood cell activity? Is that due to a decreased immune response? Is that due to the same quantitative level, but qualitatively it's a messed up immune response? Or all three of those could lead to increased risk of cancer?
It's all three. It would depend on the specific situation and the individual. Um, but I think that question opens up a good opportunity to talk about an important therapeutic approach that's used in treating cancer today. And so there's a class of drugs called immunotherapies. They're very famous. The sort of flagship immunotherapy is called Keytruda, which is generically named pembrolizumab. And pembrolizumab is a monoclonal antibody that targets a protein called PD-1 or programmed death 1. And programmed death 1 is a checkpoint protein on T cells. And T cells have these elaborate mechanisms that control whether they're activated or not. It's important to have the immune system tightly regulated, because if it's not, again, it can attack us and kill us. And we don't want that to happen. We want it to attack only the things that shouldn't be in the body, like, say, cancer or a pathogen. And so cancers have these things that they use. They express this protein, PD-1. And when they express PD-1, it tells the T cells that are nearby not to kill the cancer. So what we do is we block that signal from the cancer, and the T cells kill the cancer. So in this case, a lot of cancers, it's not necessarily all cancers, but a good number of cancers use this mechanism to cloak themselves from the immune system. And we have a therapy that can intervene on that, reveal the cancer to the immune system, and then eliminate the cancer. And these are some of the most effective cancer therapies that we have available. There's people with very durable remissions, essentially complete cures, from using these types of drugs if they have the type of cancer that will respond to them. And so one of the big things that goes on in cancer research today is finding more and more precise ways to use these immunotherapy drugs. And so hopefully it provides some insight on cancer and the immune system, but there is a lot there for sure.
So one of the things since I started kind of developing or sketching out the question I wanted to ask you, I was asking about, you know, you just mentioned one treatment that's possible. We've talked a little bit about the role of Gardasil. Something that I don't think was as hot at the time and has just become hotter and hotter. I mean, I notice all these famous people actually coming out, not because, you know, a lot of times people get plastic surgery and they're sort of ashamed to say, I had plastic surgery, maybe because there's this sense of like, oh, well, that's not your real nose, or that's not your natural thing. But we now have Ozempic, and Ozempic
Yes.
is actually kind of restoring people's maybe natural BMI, or what we
Yes.
think, you know, that word natural, whatever, subjective. But I've
Mhm.
actually seen people just saying, yeah, I'm on Ozempic. It's great, and I use it. It makes me feel better. It makes me look better. Do you think that, I mean, I think the answer is just yes, but
Yep. Yep.
like Ozempic seems to me to be a potential, not a cure for cancer directly, but indirectly, it's going to help possibly reduce obesity and therefore
Yep.
help reduce the incidence of cancer. And
Yes.
I've already heard that Ozempic itself can be quite expensive, but
Mhm.
there are forms of the peptide that, you know, is the like key ingredient or whatever, which are much
Mhm.
cheaper, and you can
It's
obtain them.
compounding.
Yeah.
Compounding pharmacies. Some people get it through and it's cheaper that way. Yep.
Yeah. So it seems like, you know, there are some people. Do you have any opinions on Ozempic? Do you think that it could solve our obesity crisis and return us to the fit and slim days of the 1960s, or do you have any views on that?
Yeah, when people were skinny because of smoking, which really significant. Smoking was playing a part in the appetite suppressant of this time too. But yeah, no, I'm very excited about GLP-1 agonists. I think, which is the class of drug that you're talking about, and there's another one that's approved on the market as well called Zepbound, or Manjaro, that has two trade names because they were originally used to treat diabetes. Just like Ozempic is also called Wegovy, but is generically named semaglutide. And so these GLP-1 agonist class, which there are many others in development, and there'll be better versions of this drug over time, and the price of the drug will come down over time as well. I think will reshape the you know the pattern of obesity and developed in the developed world significantly over time, especially if we start prophylactically giving them to people in their 20s too. If it's determined safe enough, and then people never become overweight, essentially because we've intervened on this process, and they will forever be able to only eat the proper amount and stay within the calories in, calories out formula that keep people at a a quote healthy BMI. And I'm so excited about these because essentially the real reason these are effective seems to be because they're modifying behavior. They're essentially improving the executive function of human beings. And it's I think it's certainly. I mean, they say that it slows down stomach emptying. It essentially makes your insulin signaling stronger, so you don't have the insulin resistance that's common to type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, which is of course associated with being overweight or obese. And so we have this amazing drug that makes people better at controlling themselves. I mean, I think that's great in all kinds of ways. I think we see some signal that it's potentially reducing drug overdoses. It's potentially reducing alcohol consumption. It's already improving secondary outcomes related to obesity, such as sleep apnea and coronary artery disease. And so, in some ways, it's almost like a wonder drug, because we're essentially intervening on the one lifestyle, which is basically being too sedentary and eating too many calories. And if we prevent that whole process, we can, you know, eliminate the disease of mismatch of living in the modern world, despite being, hunter-gatherer apes that wanted to binge as much as food as possible when they could find the right amount of calories, or when they could find sweet, simple calories. Which now we live in an environment where there's so much caloric abundance that it's hard to control oneself, understandably.
So, you know, I didn't understand how Ozempic actually reduced appetite. I thought that it would go into the stomach, and that it would, somehow reduce like not a maybe a hormonal response, but it was some kind of signal, whatever that signal of, then from the stomach going to the brain and saying, hey, I'm full now, stop being hungry. But it sounds like what you're saying is it's the opposite. It starts in the brain, and it improves executive, like a nootropic. It improves executive function, and then because of that, the brain goes to the stomach and it says, you're not hungry, you're fine, we're not starving or anything. And that would explain maybe why, like, there's this whole other set of behavior, and people just feel better. I mean, it would be one thing if you said, I take this weight loss drug and it makes me neurotic and anxious and I feel bad all the time. But most people who take it seem to report just like, I feel good. I mean, yeah, there's physical stuff going on. I reflect on that. But, I haven't heard, and I am, like I said, in terms of, I mentioned vaccine skepticism and other things, I am generally, I believe that you cannot conduct a long-term study over a short period of time. So, there are chemicals, forever chemicals. There are things that, 60 years ago, we actually didn't have the data to know that they were dangerous, or to tell that they led to an increased rate of cancer. Another big thing that I'm concerned about is infertility. I think that biologically, we've had a reduction in fertility that, the best explanations I've seen has been, microplastic xenoestrogens. These are ubiquitous in our environment. They have this effect on our fertility. So, when something new comes out like Ozempic or an mRNA or something like that, I say, yeah, there's these short-term benefits, and I don't want to make it illegal for people to experiment and accept, potential unknown long-term risks. But yeah, personally, I think a lot of people are in the boat of saying, I'll wait 60 years and for someone like me who's not at risk, I was not at risk for a lot of things. I mean, I'm relatively young. And it's a decent shape. I'm not obese and all of those things. And so I'm like, well, I don't need these things. Although when you say that it's going to make me increase my impulse control and make me smarter and raise my IQ, then I'm like, it's more attractive. It's more seductive. But I'm probably gonna risk experimenting, or not risk. I'm going to resist experimenting with that. But maybe some other people will be more open to that. Joe Rogan types, I think, are always like jumping on the new, that there's this new chemical that's gonna, and let's just say that a lot of that has been built around study drugs like Ritalin, which really do make you more focused. And I know people who did, they did a double major in college and triple major, people who, they set a goal and then they realize that there's this drug that can help them achieve that goal. There's a flip side of that. I think childhood use is distinct from adult use. I'm talking about ADHD prescriptions. When you have a quote unquote hyperactive, generally male child who doesn't want to sit still, doesn't want to pay attention to their ABCs or something. And so they have behavioral problems. They act out in class. They want to talk while the teacher is talking. They want to play pranks. And parents put them on Ritalin, which is an effective drug for making people focused, but I think can also lead later in life to, I forget the exact term, but essentially it means low motivation, that into adulthood you're not able to independently then be anhedonia is, I believe, the term for that.
Inability to feel pleasure.
Yeah, that would be kind of when we start talking about preventatively, because we have a problem with childhood obesity. We have a problem with very, very young children who are already obese, and that's a huge problem. And so I'm not going to be reactive and saying that if there is a 200-pound or significantly overweight 12-year-old that maybe the risks of Ozempic versus the risks of childhood obesity, maybe it makes sense to give a child that drug. Optimally, I think that, that you could also make the argument, tobacco use would be actually a lower risk profile or something. So it's difficult to weigh the risks of this. I wish we were just, we took care of ourselves, we were healthy, we got our behavioral risk under control, and we could
Mhm.
figure all of that out. But in the absence of that, then we have these drugs to give us another option. And I guess the maybe as we're finishing up here, wrapping up, um, I kind of wanted to ask, I guess broadly, what is this single, if you, because you don't control these things, but if you did have an influencer, say somebody asked you, where should the cancer funding go? I mean, is it, we've got all of these different treatments, we've got, radiation therapy, we've got drugs, we've got preventative care, we've got Ozempic, we've got all sorts of different things. And then we've got people like RFK who are going to say, well, all we need to do is force children to exercise. We need more money for gym class. Or Michelle Obama, less partisan person, I think, who said, we need to get kids active. We need to get healthy food in the cafeteria and so on. If
Mhm.
you were to say bang for the buck, best investment for America on a policy level, and you have the total like power to shove it down. They don't like Gardasil, whatever, but you're just gonna say this is the one thing. It's simple, it's easy, it's cheap, it's cost effective. This is gonna save the most lives and quality of life. Is there a single policy, or you don't have to narrow it down to one if there's several competitors?
Yeah, I'll talk about a few different things. I do, although it does seem maybe a bit paternalistic or even maybe a bit fascistic to be like, let's force the kids to exercise. I do think we should be giving more exercise opportunities to young children and requiring it more so. Like it doesn't make sense to me why in American schools we don't have at least essentially an hour of organized physical activity for all children all the way through 18 years of age, and to be teaching people how to you know to go to the gym and to exercise. Some people are intimidated by that. I grew up as an athlete and I exercise all the time, so it's like old hat to me. But for a lot of people, I think they're intimidated by that, and it's a basic competency in the modern world, and we should be doing all we can. And it's very cheap to do this. I mean, we already have things like recess, we already have things like gym class. We just need to dial up the requirements a little bit more, and focus a little bit more on that question. Um, a lot of that, of course, comes down to parenting too. We don't want to. I don't want to be too paternalistic about what we tell parents to do, but I think something like childhood obesity, I think almost certainly falls on the shoulders of parents. So again, I'm not sure there's a quick fix other than I think we should require more physical activity of children, and encourage that as much as possible, especially as childhood is increasingly dominated by screens. So however we can do that, we should do that. But returning to cancer, one of the big institutional sort of level systems level issues with the care of cancer has to do with the fact that the majority of cancer patients, they're treated in what's called the community oncology settings. So they're not treated at top line, state of the art academic medical centers. They're kind of treated by a generalist who's not necessarily an expert in whatever their disease is. But like I said before, cancer is really many diseases, and there's so much complexity about whatever disease you may specifically have. Like even when we're talking about breast cancer, well, there's many different types of breast cancer. There's triple negative breast cancer, there's hormone positive breast cancer, there's HER2 positive breast cancer. There's so many different types of these cancers, even within these different subtypes, right? So it'd be best if we can get it to a place where at least if people are still going to be treated in the community oncology setting, that they get the top of the line care from the perspective of what we call precision oncology. And so the idea of precision oncology is that we assay the patient's tumor, we assay the patient's genetics, we profile the genetics of the cancer using what we now have next generation DNA sequencing technology, which I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there's this phenomenon called the genomics cost curve. And so the cost to sequence a genome, right, when it was originally done was like $3 billion, but now we can do a genome for almost $100, right? So it's extremely cheap to get DNA sequencing. So every cancer patient should have DNA information on their tumor, in my opinion, and that should be guiding the care. And we should even be using and leveraging these next generation sequencing technologies to monitor response to care. There's ways to do that using something called liquid biopsies. And there's also the potential to use these technologies to do early diagnosis. So we mentioned earlier in the podcast about how important prevention can be. If you can diagnose cancer earlier, if you can prevent it even happening altogether, obviously the outcomes are going to be better. Because the longer cancer has time to set in, the more this hyper Darwinian process has set in, the more essentially tools it has to thwart whatever you're going to throw at it, whether it's your own immune system or whether it's a cancer treatment. And so these next generation sequencing technologies can be used for that. And what I'm getting around to in a roundabout way is that in these community oncology settings, we're not really getting the uptake, or even in a lot of academic medical center settings, we're not getting the uptake of these available technologies that we have. And so there's so much we already have so many great tools, and we're just not using them to their best ability right now, at least in the oncology setting, unfortunately.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of anxiety. I mean, we just don't have trust in institutions, and so everything is kind of like really difficult to do, and you have a general distrust in institutions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would love, for example, I sent off. I think I did the National Geographic DNA test, and
Mhm.
I haven't checked in on that. I guess I haven't been as proactive about my health as I could be. But yeah, I've seen we have the ability to predict what are the risk factors. And if people are told you're at a heightened risk for something due to your genetic profile, I think that
Mhm.
can impact people's behavior in a positive way and
Mhm.
create
Yeah.
prevention.
We've seen that already. For example, the famous case is, of course, Angelina Jolie, right? And she was genetically tested. So this is for inherited risk of cancer. And she carried a mutation in a gene called BRCA1. And BRCA1 is the breast cancer risk gene. There's many breast cancer risk genes, but this is the first one to be discovered, and is a very famous one, and confers a very high risk if you have certain loss of function mutations that impact this gene. And so someone who has a mutation like that has essentially an 80% lifetime risk for breast cancer. And one of the preventative recommendations can be a prophylactic mastectomy and a prophylactic oophorectomy, so removal of the ovaries, removal of the breasts. And so Angelina Jolie did both of those things to essentially prevent her risk for developing those types of cancer. So and there's many people who have had those same experiences, and this is a little bit misleading, as in terms of this isn't going to affect a lot of people. There's something like only 5 to 10% of the population has a high impact type mutation that can really, really increase your lifetime risk for cancer. Most of the time, what we're talking about when we're talking about these risk factors is genetics that maybe raise the risk like very modestly at most. And so it's harder to make the case that whatever lifestyle changes or whatever clinical management changes will be completely worthwhile. But there are, in these sort of less common situations, very clear benefits that can be gleaned. And so we have not maxed out or tapped out the possibilities there. And we should continue to do that, especially given how cheap it's become to get DNA information. There's this, again, there's trust issues, there's implementation issues, there's institutional issues, there's all kinds of challenges that prevent totally optimizing the available tools that we have.
Is there at this point? Do you feel like this is all kind of socially and culturally inhibited, or are there regulations? I know that there's been controversy back and forth about stem cell research and some of those things. I know that I believe Mel Gibson's father, in order to get stem cell therapy, had to go to Panama or something like that. It's not legal to do in the United States. Are you aware of regulations that are on the books now that are inhibiting research that you believe could be productive in terms of reducing mortality for cancer?
Yeah. So in cancer field, the big thing is essentially the FDA, because most of the time we're talking about therapeutics. And so new cancer drugs, they need to meet the market threshold for approval. That's governed by the FDA, and that's essentially like the typical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 type clinical development that goes on for a drug. That's like on average like 10 years, and 90% of the drugs that enter this process after preclinical development fail. Right. So there's like tons of waste essentially because of that. And it'd be nice if we could have a 100% hit rate. Of course, that's going to be impossible based on how research works. But there are ways in which we could lower the barrier for approval that would likely be beneficial. And in some ways in the cancer field, we've already deployed this. There's this program from the FDA called the Accelerated Approval Program, which actually started due to HIV. So there was a lot of essentially gay men who are dying of HIV, and there weren't drugs available, and we couldn't get them drugs fast enough. And one of the ways that we use to get them drugs faster, and that's eventually how we have this, antiretroviral cocktail that now makes HIV a chronic, almost normal life condition, versus essentially something that would kill you very, very quickly. And because of the accelerated approval program, in part, of course, we get lucky with a lot of the research too, that we figure these things out. But that program has essentially been repurposed by oncology. And now we have a lot of cancer drugs that get to market faster because of this program. It's almost exclusively used by cancer drugs now. And so, it would be nice to find a better balance. I don't think we can just, there's some talk in libertarian circles about entirely just end the FDA. And I don't think the American public would accept that. The FDA exists as is today, essentially because of the thalidomide crisis, right? And the thalidomide crisis didn't really happen in America. Very few Americans ever received thalidomide. It was, if you're familiar with that story, right? Pregnant women would be given thalidomide as a way to manage morning sickness, and it ended up causing birth defects in the children, where they essentially would have major issues with limb development. They basically have improper limb development. And so this mostly happened in Europe, where the studies were being conducted, and didn't happen in America because of a essentially FDA bureaucrat that prevented this. But this whole scandal brought us the typical FDA approval process that we deal with today for the most part. And, just over time, we continue to add on to that process, and we increase the cost of R&D. So my roundabout rambling answer is just that we need to find ways to make R&D more efficient. And one of the possible answers is leveraging our genetic knowledge. So there is some evidence that because we've developed all this genetic knowledge, that we can leverage that to be more effective about our drug development. So I think we need to push on that as much as possible. So whatever we can do to really maximize all the low-hanging fruit that exists in using genetics to guide drug discovery, we need to do that as fast as we can to get as much as we can out of it.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I have not, even though I'm over time here, I haven't wanted to end it, just because I think we could really use another hour to explore these issues further. I normally would ask guests, what are you reading? What are you promoting? But you've done a great job on your blog of, here's what I'm reading this month, and here's what I think you should go read. So I really recommend people just go to the blog and check it out. I mean, it's got something for everybody, where it's not just cancer all day, all the time, but it's something I'm interested in, and I'm really glad I brought you on to correct some of the misconceptions that I had. And, if I'm a smart guy and I have some misconceptions, probably a lot of other people do. And hopefully this helps, the education process and puts us on a path toward greater knowledge and better solutions to these problems. So, Stetson, this was awesome. I really hope to have you on again sometime, maybe about something completely different. But in any case, this has been awesome. If there's anything that you do want to final thoughts or promote, I'll give you the floor before we end.
No, I agree with all that. It was great to talk to you, and it was great.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we'll end it there, and we'll see you again next time.
See you then.
All righty. Bye-bye. Okay. Like, comment, restack. I got to go. See you guys later. Bye-bye.